Hello and welcome back to Hollywood Wargaming. Today we are doing something very exciting and going back and reviewing again some of the previous units that we started the channel with, as since those videos were originally recorded and uploaded, there have been numerous shifts in meta such as points changes and new upgrade cards, and also my experience as a player has changed dramatically. And if I'm being quite honest, some of those initial videos were recorded when I only had a handful of games under my belt, and I think that does show a little bit in some of them. So here we are with our 2021 Unit Review Redux, starting off with Phase 1 Clone Troopers. Now, the Phase 1 Clone Troopers are of course going to be your standard core unit for the Grand Army of the Republic, which the faction launched with and are present in the core set. And that means if you are a Republic player, chances are you are going to have at least some Phase 1 Clone Troopers. And with us, to this date, only having two options for core units, if you are a Republic player, chances are you are making use of Phase 1s. So let's go ahead and start breaking down this unit and looking at how we can best use them, starting off with their unit card itself. And here we are going to have a 4-model core trooper option, coming in at 52 points, which is going to be 13 points per model, making Phase 1s the second most expensive core unit in the game aside from Phase 2s, and has them tied with shore troopers in terms of base cost. Below that points cost, we are going to see that they have a heavy weapons upgrade option, followed up by a personnel, then a gear and grenade slot, which is all very much standard for your core trooper unit. But moving over to the right hand side of the card, we are going to see that their unit type is clone trooper, not just regular trooper, which means they are going to be able to share tokens with other clone troopers who are at range 1 and within line of sight of them, which as we all currently know is extremely advantageous and really one of the core gimmicks of this faction. Below that, we are going to see that they are a 1 health, 1 courage unit with a red defense die, followed up by no innate surges and a speed 2 movement. Nothing too out of the ordinary there, especially for your baseline core unit. And below that, we are going to see a single black die for unarmed melee combat, followed up by the DC-15A blaster, throwing 1 black die at range 1 to 3. So what do I think of this unit's baseline stats overall? Well, you are paying a premium price for a premium core unit, one that sort of has the best of both worlds between Rebels and Empire with that good offensive black die, and also the sturdiness of that red defense that our boys in shiny white armor are known to have. And while there is no innate surging on this unit, like Rebels or Stormtroopers, that is A, not really a drawback when it comes to defensive roles, and B, very much remedied by that Clone Trooper keyword, especially when you start introducing surge tokens into the equation. But much like most other core units, there is going to be a keyword here that adds to the overall gimmick of the unit, and that is going to be fire support, which essentially, if this unit has a face-up order token, another unit within range 1 may combine dice pools with this unit, which would flip their order token and deny the unit an activation, but allow you to create a very large dice pool combining any keywords you may have. And there are many situations in Star Wars Legion where creating that large dice pool is better than having those two units activate on their own, especially when it comes to alpha striking and removing or at least damaging immediate threats before they can activate. And once again, I do want to highlight that the Clone Trooper unit type is sort of its own keyword and how it interacts with the game. So overall, we are getting a pretty robust unit profile here that just has all-around reliable dice, and also two very potent abilities with the Clone Trooper token sharing and fire support. And that does make Phase 1 Clone Troopers one of the best core trooper units in the game, probably only surpassed by Phase 2s, though that does all come at the drawback of being a high points cost unit. But let's go ahead and start looking at the potential upgrades for the Clone Troopers here, starting off with heavy weapons. And first of all, I do want to add a little caveat here that I have added all of the potential options for the heavy weapons and personnel categories, but I have marked the standout upgrades with a red critical symbol in the upper right hand corner of the card. So while I am going to cover all of the options here, those are going to be the standouts, and what I would recommend you focus on using. And first up here, we are going to have the DC-15, a weapon that has since dropped in 3 points from 30 to 27, and will be throwing 2 red dice at range 1 to 4 with the critical 1 keyword. Now, I am a pretty big fan of the DC-15 myself, not just because of its appearance in the movies and overall aesthetic, but as a person who's rather unlucky with dice, I do like the safety net of red dice, and adding critical 1 onto a unit that has no innate surges is a huge bonus. And hey, range 1 to 4 means you can poke your enemies at a pretty respectable distance. However, bar Echo and 5s, this is the most expensive weapon upgrade here, And unfortunately for the DC-15, the Z6 does beat it out in terms of a lower points cost and having an overall higher volume of dice, which in a faction that can share aim tokens, raises the ceiling when it comes to the maximum amount of hits you can get with these weapon upgrades, and it usually plays better when you are making use of fire support and combining those 6 white dice into larger dice pools that have other keywords, or perhaps even things like Surge to Crit. And if the DC-15 wasn't 4 points more expensive than the Z6, then I think we would be having a very different conversation over which one you should take, but I definitely am still a fan of the DC-15 in more casual games, and overall I think the DC-15 is a very good weapon that is unfortunately just surpassed by a less expensive option. And that basically does also cover the next weapon on this list, which of course is the Z6. Again, it's hard to beat that sheer volume of dice, which now comes in at just 23 points instead of the original 25. And while it may not be range 4 like the DC-15, you do have the Take That Clankers card from Clone Captain Rex, and overall you do want the rest of those range 3 DC-15As firing also, so range 3 on the Z6 really isn't that big of a deal, and when it comes down to cost efficiency, the Z6 is just the flat out winner, almost regardless of what combat role you're trying to use your phase 1s in. Also, it is worth mentioning that the Z6 and the DC-15 come in your standard Phase 1 squad, and as things currently stand, they are better heavy weapon options than what you see in the Phase 1 upgrade expansion box, and if you're a new player getting into the game, I do think that makes the upgrade expansion for Phase 1s a relatively skippable purchase, probably more so than any other faction's upgrade expansion. But we are going to go over those 2 heavy weapons anyways, starting off with the RPS-6 rocket launcher, which has since dropped from 26 points down to 21 points, and that should tell you a lot about this weapon, as it not only is not the ideal heavy weapon option here, but also not even the ideal rocket launcher, throwing a single rainbow of 1 red, 1 black, and 1 white at range 2 to 4, with the Impact 2 and Cumbersome keyword. And while Impact 2 has become incredibly valuable when using fire support thanks to the prevalence of things like AA5s in the current meta, the Cumbersome keyword really is something that holds this upgrade back, as it prevents you from moving and firing in the same activation, which may not sound like the end of the world with a range 4 weapon, when you consider that there are only 6 turns in a match, and 6 chances for this weapon to shoot. It makes for a scenario where you really have to get great positioning with this weapon in order to justify its 21 points. Still, this weapon does have its place in the current climate of today's meta revolving around heavies, and adding Impact 2 to a fire support pool, perhaps one that already has Impact in it, can make for some very strong anti-armor plays. And with the infantry support platform on the horizon, I think fire supporting an RPS alongside the missile upgrades on that vehicle could potentially be a very viable strategy for dealing with enemy heavies. But even in those fire support scenarios, you're probably not going to be running more than 1 RPS in your entire list, and because of that, I really cannot suggest it as a mainstay weapon on the Phase 1s, and as future releases come out and clones start to get more tools to respond to armor with, I think it may fall even more so out of favor. And its popularity does kind of hinge on the prevalence of heavies, so with a countermeasure unit like an RPS, if its intended targets, like say the AA5, starts to go out of style, this weapon will along with it. But next up from the Phase 1 unit expansion, we do have the DP-23, a weapon that has since dropped from 27 down to 23 points, and will be throwing 2 black and 1 white die at range 1 to 2, with the Pierce 1 keyword. Now, Pierce is kind of the holy grail of weapon keywords, as it does allow you to punch through 1 block result, which means your enemy is going to have to rely on things like dodges and cover to prevent themselves from receiving guaranteed damage. But there are some very clear drawbacks on this weapon, first of which is going to be the weakest dice pool of any of these heavy weapon upgrades. It's definitely not terrible at 2 black and 1 white, but it does create this interesting trade-off where you're getting rid of your overall potential hits for Pierce 1 almost getting a guaranteed wound through a block, and there's definitely something to be said about just flat out forcing more saves than trying to eke through 1 wound with Pierce. After that, this weapon is also only range 1 to 2, which means your clones are going to have to get danger close to use it, and it won't mesh with the overall flexibility of those range 1 to 3 DC-15A blasters, which I think is what really kills this weapon in a Phase 1 squad. Now, we do have Take That Clankers, which can turn this into a range 3 weapon for a turn, but at the same time that can turn something like a Z6 into a range 4 weapon, so while that command card may make the DP-23 a bit more usable for that turn, you are still in the same conundrum of, yeah, but the Z6 does this. So overall, I do think the DP-23 is very much one of those carrot on the end of a stick weapons, sort of like the Fleet Troopers with their scattergun, as players end up bending over backwards and spending excessive amount of points just to make that Pierce keyword work, when you could, again, instead just be trying to force more saves. Still, the DP-23 is a very unique weapon for a core trooper option, especially a baseline one, but when you put it behind that $20 paywall of the unit upgrade expansion, it really becomes something that I just cannot recommend. But we do have 2 more heavy weapon options for your Phase 1 clone troopers, and these are going to be 2 ARC Trooper characters who come in the ARC Trooper expansion box, a box that, unlike the Phase 1 upgrades, I highly recommend you buy, as these 2 heavy weapon options can be placed in any core trooper unit, and the ARC Trooper squads themselves. And we're going to start off by taking a look at the first ARC Trooper character here, and that is going to be Echo. And coming in at a whopping 40 points, Echo is going to be a multi-wound heavy upgrade, meaning he will be able to soak 2 wounds before he's removed off the table, and he is going to be throwing 2 red dice at range 1 to 5 with his DC 15X, which will not only be immune to deflection, but also have critical 1 and lethal 1, which will allow you to spend an aim token to gain Pierce, making Echo a single-man strike team sniper that you can drop into your core squads. However, Echo is also going to be the squad leader if you choose to add him, which means he will be the last model in this unit that you have to take wounds on and remove, which is definitely an advantage over your standard heavy weapon who will usually have to die before your squad leader. After that, Echo is also going to give you Reliable 1, meaning at the beginning of the turn, during the activation phase, you are going to gain a surge token on this squad. And when you consider that Echo gives you critical 1, that means you can probably save this surge token for your defensive roles, which kind of bumps that 4+ armor save up to a 3+, albeit in limited fashion. So overall, Echo is a really big bundle buy for a heavy weapon upgrade, and he comes close to costing as much as an entire Phase 1 squad on its own, but I can't say that points cost is not justified. He does bring a lot to the table, notably as a second avenue in which Phase 1s can get Pierce, which is very unique to this trooper unit, but also with Reliable 1, a keyword that shows up on the Phase 2 clone troopers, which is remarkably useful in a faction that can share those green tokens to other units. But overall, I gotta say, Echo is kind of just too expensive to put in a Phase 1 squad, and you are paying a premium for that sniper weapon profile, which overall does not mesh with the rest of the clone trooper squad, as again, you are paying a lot of points to begin with for those DC 15A blasters, throwing black dice, so basically you're paying a lot for 2 different weapon profiles that don't exactly mesh with each other. So overall, I do believe that Echo is a character who is best used in an ARC Trooper strike team, and if you really do want to run him in a large clone trooper squad, I would do it on Phase 2s, as they do have Courage 2, as Echo would be easier to suppress when run in a Phase 1 squad, more so than any other unit in your list. But lastly here, we are going to have 5s coming in at 36 points, throwing 3 black dice at range 1 to 3, who, much like Echo, has 2 health points and will become the unit leader, increasing their courage by 1 and also giving them the Coordinate Clone Trooper keyword, which of course means anytime a unit with 5s would be issued an order, he may issue an order to another friendly Clone Trooper unit within range 1, regardless of their rank. So yes, 5s could push orders onto someone like Clone Captain Rex, which could be extremely advantageous in scenarios where you're running 2 commanders, and the one who isn't Rex is playing his cards. That being said, it is also just all around advantageous for order control, and works very well with a bunch of units who have the fire support keyword, which, if you need to be reminded, does require a face-up order token to be used. It also creates some very unique interactions with certain command cards, notably something like Take That Clankers, that benefits any unit with a face-up order token, regardless of where they got it from. On top of all that, 5s is also just bringing 3 more black dice and 2 more wounds to the table here, which is about the equivalent of adding 2.5 clone troopers to the squad. And unlike Echo, the weapon profile you are paying for suits the squad perfectly, and that additional Courage 1 is greatly going to help you out with suppression, and bring your Phase 1s a little bit closer to being Phase 2s. So overall, 5s is just flat out great, and much like Clone Captain Rex in today's meta, if you're not running him in a Republic list, you are running that list wrong. He is very pricey, but he is just absolutely worth every penny, regardless if he's going into a Phase 1 or a Phase 2 clone squad. But that is going to wrap up all of our heavy weapon options here, with 5s and the Z6 being the standout choices, with note of the RPS being very viable in certain scenarios, as contemporary as they may be, and the DC-15 as just being something that kind of has a strong place in my heart. but that is going to move us along to our personnel upgrades here, of which we do have quite a lot, considering that the Phase 1 squad can not only take personnel from the unit upgrade expansion, but also the specialist upgrade. So let's go ahead and crack our knuckles and get right into it. And first up here, we are going to have our standard Phase 1 Clone Trooper personnel upgrade, which of course is just going to add a single mini onto the unit, which has since dropped from 13 points down to just 10 points, as players were coming to the realization that it was simply more efficient to put those 13 points towards another Clone Trooper squad, which would give you an additional activation, instead of just padding out an existing one. Now, all that being said, I am actually a fan of the personnel upgrade here, notably if you do have a Phase 1 squad that you plan on doing some heavy lifting with, as it will pad out their durability with that extra wound, which is pretty good if your list looks something like one squad that has 5s in it, and then a bunch of other bare-bone clone troopers, as your opponent is very obviously going to single out 5s and try and take them off the table. So making it more of a hurdle to do that is going to be pretty advantageous, and the Phase 1 Clone Trooper personnel upgrade is probably the most economic way to do that. But next up, we are going to have two upgrade options here that came in the unit upgrade expansion. The first of which is going to be our Phase 1 Clone Captain. And this guy did drop from 17 down to 14 points, and will not only count as your unit leader, but also give you a training upgrade slot, and the exhaustible ability that will allow you to ignore the effects of suppression at the cost of you not being able to remove any suppression tokens during that activation. So there's a few things going on with this card. It's an extra body that gives you a training upgrade, and also gives you a sort of card up your sleeve during turns where you really need to ignore that suppression, which definitely does come into play with Phase 1 Clone Troopers, as they do only have Courage 1. Now, that being said, I do find it more valuable to straight up counter suppression. outright counter suppression tokens than to invest in gimmicks that only ignore it for one turn on one unit. And when you combine that philosophy with the fact that Phase 2 Clone Troopers have an innate training slot, it does make the Phase 1 Clone Captain a bit of a dud in my opinion. Again, with the points adjustment, he's definitely not unusable. In fact, it does seem that the Stormtrooper Captain has gained popularity in recent time, who does offer the same abilities, but at 2 points less, though I do have my doubts about that build too. But then again, Empire does also not have Phase 2 Stormtroopers, and perhaps in the very cutthroat meta of the competitive scene, that suppression negating ability may be very valuable, but overall I still do see the Phase 1 Clone Captain as one of the weaker personnel options. And honestly, a main contributing factor to that is going to be the next two personnel upgrades that we look at, the first of which is going to be the Clone Specialist, who, much like the Clone Captain, has dropped from 17 to 14 points, and will give you an extra upgrade slot in the form of a gear upgrade, along with an exhaustible ability to give yourself one free aim, dodge, or surge token, which is a pretty sleek workaround for taking a personnel upgrade that would give you training, only for you to spend another 4 points taking offensive push in that training slot. Now, overall, aim tokens are more valuable than both surge or dodge tokens, so tapping him for that aim token is likely going to be the main reason you are taking a Clone Specialist, but it is nice to have the flexibility there should you need it. And overall, with the Clone Specialist being a discounted body with a built-in offensive push, he is definitely one of the standout upgrades for the personnel slot on the Phase 1s, and I think in the situations where you would end up investing points and putting more bodies into a Phase 1 squad, you would also be willing to chip up the extra points and get that built-in offensive push. But next up, we are going to have a slew of personnel upgrades that came with our Clone Specialist upgrade pack. And first up here, we are going to have another recommended personnel upgrade with the Clone Commander, who will be rather expensive coming in at 20 points, but will give you Inspire 1, Reliable 1, and also become the squad leader, which essentially buffs this squad up into being a Phase 2 squad, as you are sort of getting a courage boost with Inspire 1, and also the same Reliable 1 keyword that will give you a surge token at the beginning of each turn, though there is a bit of a monkey's paw with that Inspire 1, as being outright able to remove suppression is arguably better than just having one more courage. However, it does specifically say that you remove that suppression token from another friendly unit after the rally step, meaning the squad cannot be the target of the Inspire keyword and remove a suppression, which definitely is a bit of a ding to the Clone Commander here, and I will admit he barely made the recommendation, but if you are looking to counter suppression, I think sprinkling Inspire 1 in your list here and there is a better workaround than investing in things like Endurance, as it is overall more versatile, and you are getting it in a package that creates some more token generation, along with beefing up your squad. That being said, there is a valid debate between putting a clone commander in a phase 1 or a phase 2 squad, as a phase 1 squad is going to be less expensive overall, which may allow you to get more commanders into a list. However, a phase 2 squad is going to have that greater courage value and stack reliable 1 up to reliable 2, something that may be advantageous if you plan on doing a lot of token sharing, but could also end up just being overkill if you're not mobbing clone troopers. But with phase 1 clone troopers being 10 points less than the phase 2s, you're able to put those 10 points towards a clone commander, who will create a sort of pseudo phase 2 squad with reliable 1 and inspire, along with having an extra body in the squad. But that will bring us to our next personnel upgrade from that clone specialist box, and that will be our clone medic, the first medic personnel upgrade in the game that is not a non-combatant, which means he will be adding another black dice to your attack pool, and also does not have to be the second to last model removed from the squad. However, because he is a combatant, he cannot treat as much capacity as, say, a medical droid would, and at a rather steep 20 points, he will only be healing 1 wound, and that means you are essentially getting 1 black die and 2 wounds for the price of 2 phase 1 clone troopers who would traditionally give you that extra black die. But in the scenario we have here, where you only have 1 personnel upgrade slot, you pretty much are paying a giant premium for an extra wound, which bluntly put isn't really worth the extra 10 points, and you would be getting more bang for your buck on this personnel upgrade in the phase 2 squad, as you would be healing more expensive models. But I suppose if you want a phase 1 squad hanging out near Obi-Wan Kenobi, you could stick a medic in there and heal up Obi for any guardian shots he may fail to deflect. And if you are running a squad with someone like, say, 5s, and you really want to maximize your wound count for this unit, the medic would bring the squad up to 8 health points, effectively. Though, as you will see in the future, that is a route I would probably take on phase 2 troopers before phase 1s. But even in the most ideal builds, it is hard to justify spending 20 points on what is essentially 1.5 clone troopers, and most of the time you are better off just putting those points towards another unit, and avoid the sandpit that is over upgrading a low activation list. But next up here, we are going to have the Clone Comms Technician, a 12-point upgrade that is going to give you an extra personnel, who will also grant the unit a comms upgrade slot. However, unlike the Captain and Specialist who give you other upgrade slots, the Comms Technician must take a comms upgrade, which is a bit redundant considering that there's no reason you would take this guy over a phase 1 personnel without intention to use that comms upgrade slot. So basically you are paying 2 points for the comms upgrade slot on this unit, and then the comms upgrade card itself, which means realistically this guy usually does come out to around 17 points, or potentially even 22 if you are going all in on the HQ uplink, which actually is a viable synergy when using someone like 5s who has coordinate. But overall, there's not a whole lot of use for comms on clone troopers. They're not quite cheap enough to be a dedicated support unit and take comms relay, though you could theoretically do that to stack orders onto your saber tank or another hero, but that does usually end up being a very points intensive strategy. So overall, phase 1 troopers do not make the best use of comms upgrades, and while there are some niche strategies that do work here, notably 5s with the HQ uplink, they are usually one-offs in your list, and you really need to build your entire army around them from the command cards on down. But lastly here, we are going to have our Clone Engineer, an 18-point upgrade who is going to be, much like the Clone Medic, a combatant version of the repair droids we've seen in other factions, who will be able to make use of that DC-15A blaster and add an extra dice into your attack pool, but will only have a repair capacity of 1, unlike the other repair personnel who usually have a capacity of 2. And considering that this is not a droid army, the Clone Engineer is only going to be as relevant as vehicles are in clone lists, which for the time being is not very. And I have to say, these healer and repair personnel who are combatants are in a bit of a weird spot, as in Star Wars Legion, when you do take something that repairs or heals another unit, you are usually doing so with a very decisive intent, and that core unit that does take those personal upgrades usually become a full-blown support unit, i.e. stormtroopers with a medical droid following around Palpatine, and this sort of halfway between I'm a combatant personnel, but can also do some minor healing or repairs, simply doesn't pass in more cutthroat competitive lists. But even if they're healing and repair personnel did have double the capacity like they do in other factions, they still wouldn't mesh well in the Republic, as Phase 1 clone troopers are still 52 points at base cost, which is a bit too pricey for that bona fide support role. So a unit that is making use of those personnel upgrades is going to be fighting an uphill battle to justify that premium that you're paying for them. But that is going to wrap up our robust list of personnel upgrades here, and many of these faces you will see later in the video when we are doing our recommended builds. Just know that the Clone Specialist is the strongest recommendation for personnel in my opinion, again thanks to that integrated offensive push, with the Captain trailing behind him with a softer recommendation, but overall don't feel like you need to put anything in the personnel slot. Again, if you plan on running large amounts of Clone Troopers, you can simply leave those personnel blank and put those points towards other squads that are going to get you more activations, which is probably one of the main reasons you're running Phase 1s over Phase 2s anyways. But now we are going to check out the gear slot on the Phase 1 Clone Troopers, and honestly, there's not much here. I threw in a few cards just to give you options as what may be useful, but the hard recommendation by a mile is going to be targeting scopes, a 4-point upgrade that is going to give you precise 1, allowing you to reroll a third dice each time you spend an aim token, which definitely is going to happen multiple times throughout the course of a match, and is super useful on those Z6 units who are going to be throwing large amounts of white dice, which as we all know are very reluctant to show paint. And the Clone Trooper token sharing ability is going to help ensure that you spend those aim tokens to make the best use of this card. But much like that personnel upgrade, you do have to gauge this card and think to yourself, is it worth putting this into 4 units? Or take those 16 points and put them towards another unit, or perhaps something like another heavy weapon upgrade that will simply give you more dice to roll overall. So while targeting scopes is my top recommendation here, it's not necessary, especially if your squad isn't running a high volume of dice with something like a Z6, and I would say that as a rule of thumb, avoid putting it in a squad that doesn't have more than 5 black dice. But next up here we are going to have some lesser recommendations, and by lesser I mean sharply lesser than the previous one. And first up here is going to be portable scanners, a 6-point upgrade that is going to give you the take cover action, allowing you to give a friendly unit at range 1 a dodge token. And this recommendation exists for 2 reasons, and those 2 reasons are Obi-Wan Kenobi and the Saber Tank, 2 units that basically thrive on dodge tokens, and would certainly benefit from being able to get them outside of their own activations, especially with a Saber Tank that doesn't have its own deck of command cards, or other things like force reflexes. And to be quite honest, at 200 points, you don't want to be spending that tank's activations taking dodge actions, so portable scanners would come in handy there. But as I mentioned earlier, Phase 1 Clone Troopers are a bit too pricey to be hiking around as another unit's caddy, and if you were to put portable scanners and a clone engineer into a Phase 1 squad for it to follow around your Saber Tank, they would end up costing 76 points, which is on par with naked Death Troopers, and overall just simply not worth that investment. It is a piece of gear that is better suited for the Clone Commander in that HQ slot, but a Phase 1 squad would be the runner-up for that role behind him. So yeah, overall portable scanners are a pretty low recommendation, though they do have their niche uses. And the same is going to go for our next gear upgrade, which is Ascension Cables, which will give you the scale keyword, allowing you to get over difficult terrain without suffering movement penalties or potential damage from clambering, which is just very useful on terrain-dense boards, as it can get your clones into better firing positions or closer to an objective. So if you do have a Phase 1 squad loaded up with something like a Z6 or a DC-15, and you want them to get into a high firing position, perhaps even on an objective, Ascension Cables are going to be a godsend when getting into that position. But I wouldn't put this on a squad that you don't anticipate to do some heavy lifting, and if you are trying to get a squad into a good firing position, there are honestly better candidates, namely things like ARC Trooper strike teams. So unless you plan on playing on a board that has some seriously dramatic terrain, this is a rather superfluous upgrade to slap onto your Phase 1 squads, but it's one of those things that once every blue moon could give you a huge leg up on the battlefield, but it does beg the question if that's worth investing in. So with all of our gear recommendations wrapped up here, we are going to have one main standout with the targeting scopes, and will move us along to our grenade upgrades. An upgrade slot that is more oftenly skipped than not by a very large margin. And I'm not going to have any recommendations here, honestly, as I do think it is a bit of a waste of points, but I will quickly go over what options I would take if I had to take a grenade on the Phase 1s. And first up here is going to be the Concussion Grenade, which at now just 3 points is going to give the squad blast if they are within range 1, which will allow you to ignore enemy cover, forcing your target to make more saving rolls than they usually would, which is honestly a pretty strong advantage considering you're not sacrificing any firepower here. However, it does require you to be within range 1, and Phase 1 Clone Troopers for the most part are simply not that aggressive, and when you do encounter an enemy unit within range 1, it's usually a Saber user embedding himself in your line, and at that point they're probably not relying on cover much anyways. So while this is an inexpensive upgrade that does give you a very powerful keyword, especially when used with fire support, it's very much held back by its limited range. which makes it not the best way to spend your points, but a viable one nonetheless. And that pretty much is going to be the case with all of our grenades here. They're all pretty much just tools that you can use when you close the range with your opponents, which overall just doesn't really happen that much with phase 1s if you're playing them correctly. And next up we are going to have the impact grenades. Another upgrade that has dropped down to 3 points, and will give you impact 1 for each grenade thrown with this weapon profile. And yes, it will stack, something I got wrong in my previous videos. So basically, if your clone squad gets within close range of an opponent, each model throwing a black die will gain impact 1, which will stack for each model within range 1, meaning a 4-man clone squad will gain impact 4, which will basically nullify the point of your enemy having armor, and could actually be very viable against incoming transports that are dropping off payloads, such as an AA-5 with Wookiee warriors. So actually not a bad upgrade in today's armor-heavy meta, but still overall just an upgrade that I would not take universally. But lastly here, we are going to have one of the more unique grenade upgrade options, which is of course the smoke grenade, which will allow you to basically deploy cover to all nearby units with a smoke token, which in my opinion is actually a pretty underrated tool, especially if you are going to be mobbing your troopers together, which clones often are doing anyways thanks to that token sharing. But most notably, this card has dropped from 6 all the way down to 2 points, which is a pretty negligible upgrade. And while a lot of players seem to be avoiding this because it does cost an action, it is an action that only needs to be equipped and performed by 1 unit, and will then benefit everyone within its aura. So overall, I do think this is a useful tool if you are running a more gunline oriented list, but it's also not going to benefit you against melee attacks, which is becoming very relevant in the prevailing meta, arguably even more so than it ever has before. So if ranged attacks are an afterthought in your opponent's list, you may not be getting the best use out of smoke grenades, but I do think smoke is a mechanic that the community should try playing around with a bit more, as it pretty much has been hand-waved away since its release. But I definitely think there is a place somewhere in the meta for deployable cover. But with all that being said, we are going to wrap up the grenades here, which will in turn move us along to the part of the video where I show you how I would kit out my phase 1 clone trooper squads, and present you some various builds that range from competitive all the way down to thematic and casual. And with phase 1 troopers having access to both unit and specialist upgrade packs, you are going to see some various alternatives to how I would build these squads, as I will have various recommendations displayed in a smaller format beneath the existing card. And our first build here is going to be what I call all reliable, as it has proven to be a tried and tested build for the phase 1 and even phase 2 squads since the Republic has been released. And first up here, we are of course going to be equipping the Z6 Rotary Blaster, as its high volume of dice relative to its points cost simply makes it the king of heavy weapons. And I'll be honest, if you really want to get cutthroat about your core options, you could stop after this upgrade here and have a 75-point squad with red armor throwing 10 dice. But personally, I do like putting some extra wounds into my Z6 squads, and if I am on a bargain budget for that, I will go with the standard phase 1 personnel, who is now just 10 points. Though I do think that phase 1 clone specialist is also a very viable upgrade here, as again, he is going to give you that built-in offensive push, and those white dice from the Z6, simply put, very much appreciate that. So also a very strong option for that personnel slot, with the clone commander being my third recommendation here. And it is worth noting that your commander isn't going to die as fast as your clone specialist is, as he is the squad leader. And I have played those very sour matches where I get hit with a large volley of fire, and I whiff enough armor saves to where I have to choose between removing my Z6 or my specialist before he has even tapped his ability. So overall, pairing any of those personnel with a Z6 will do you well, though the commander is probably the lower of the 3 recommended, and that mainly is due to his points cost. But lastly here, we are of course going to have targeting scopes. Not much to say here other than you're throwing a ton of dice, a lot of them are white, and you definitely want those rerolls. So if you're not trying to go super cutthroat with the squad, this is a solid upgrade to take, and we'll bring the squad in at 89 points. Now 89 points is very expensive for a core trooper option, but you are getting a unit here that is more powerful than most other factions' special forces, and ultimately this is one of the more affordable ways to kit out a phase 1 squad. But next up, we are going to have yet another competitive way to build a phase 1 squad, and this one will be a one-off in your army, as you are going to be running 5s in that heavy weapon slot, who will bring you 2 more wounds in the squad, along with 3 black dice, all while bringing your courage value up to 2 and giving you that coordinate keyword. So there's a lot going on with 5s, and he really does turn this squad into a beast of its own. And honestly, you could stop it there and run it as an 88-point squad, who will have 6 wounds and throw 7 black dice, which is honestly pretty impressive for that points cost. However, I am a big proponent of putting more personnel in the squad to make sure 5s stays on the tabletop, as that coordinate ability really does give you a ton of control over your order tokens. And until 5s is either destroyed or the last man standing, you are going to greatly benefit from him being alive. So the obvious go-to here if you are on a budget is putting another Phase 1 trooper in here for just 10 points. And that is going to bring you up to 7 wounds and 8 black dice, which at 98 points is pretty much on par with a lot of heroes in that range. However, we do have some other options here that can get a little bit more intense. The first of which is of course going to be paying that premium for the clone medic, which is going to max out the potential wounds in this Phase 1 squad and bring you up to 8 wounds and 8 black dice, which is an extremely beefy core unit. Alternatively, you can go the route of bringing the clone commander here, and at that point, with +1 courage from 5s and reliable 1 from the commander, you are basically upgrading the squad to a Phase 2 squad, though at this point you are going to be hitting about 110 points, which needless to say is quite pricey, and if you go with the medic, you are going to be on the same boat there, as they are both the same points. But we do have a third personnel option here, one that actually can be quite competitive in the right list. And that is going to be the Clone Comm Specialist, who of course will be making use of that comm slot to take HQ uplink. That way, regardless of what command card is being played, 5s can tap that HQ uplink, activate himself, and then push an order onto another friendly clone trooper unit with the coordinate keyword, which will turn him into his own little command squad. However, this is going to be the most expensive route to take with your personnel upgrade slot, as it will cost you 22 points for both the Comm Specialist and the HQ uplink. But if you are running a list with someone like, say, Jedi, who are very selfish with their 1-pip cards, which, mind you, are often played at some of the most crucial turns of the game, this could be a viable route to make sure face-up order tokens get onto other units. And keep in mind, it is not restricted to core troopers, so it can be pushed back onto Clone Captain Rex, or perhaps other units like ARC Trooper strike teams, which again is going to be very useful to have when you are running commanders like Obi-Wan Kenobi or Anakin, who won't be activating other units with their 1-pips. But regardless of what option you do choose, I think adding a personnel in here is probably the best build in which you can do so. Again, 5s is not just a good addition to your squad as a heavy weapon, but also good for your army's coordination and order control overall, something that a good opponent will target and take out of your list if able to, and sometimes having just one more wound can deter your opponent from accomplishing that. And also, I am personally just a major fan of creating those large black dice attack pools, which will bring us to our final upgrade here. That is of course going to be targeting scopes. Basically, once you start getting into 7 or 8 dice in your attack pool and they're not red, targeting scopes becomes incredibly usable, as even black dice can be somewhat unreliable, and precise 1 does help a lot. But this recommended build with the standard Phase 1 personnel is going to come in at 102 points, which is definitely on the pricey side, but that is mainly thanks to 5s himself, who I do think makes this build very much worth its points cost. But now we are going to start getting away from some of the more competitive builds for your Phase 1 troopers, and look at some potentially more casual stuff, starting off with the CQB clones, who are going to be making use of that DP-23 close-range pierce weapon, which again is held back by a weaker dice pool and shorter range. But hey, let's take the bait and try and make it work here. It is relatively affordable and it does have pierce, and it's not like clones have a weak dice pool to start with, so throwing 2 more black die and a white die in there is still a pretty respectable attack pool. And we are going to add a personnel in here in the form of a Phase 1 clone specialist, who will bring our dice pool up to 8, 7 of which are black, and also give us that pseudo offensive push to make sure we have an aim token on the turn where we do close into that range 2 and attack with that DP-23. But the Clone Specialist is also going to give us another upgrade gear slot here, something that Phase 1s usually don't make good use of, but it does come in handy here as we are going to be taking both targeting scopes and recon intel, and at a mere 2 points, that recon intel is going to give us a little bit of a push at the beginning of the game to make sure we can close with that short range weapon, which will be a nice little bonus on top of that precise 1 we get from our targeting scopes. And lastly, we are going to finish off the squad by taking Concussion Grenades. And my main argument against Concussion Grenades earlier in this video was that clone troopers aren't usually that aggressive and don't usually want to get that close to your enemies. But in this DP-23 build, we are going to be closing into range 2 already, so why not push a little bit further and try and get within range 1, allowing you to ignore your opponent's cover, which will make this assault squad very good at digging your enemies out of embedded positions, and overall will come in at 98 points, which, while not exactly ideal, is still pretty affordable for clone troopers, especially one that is making use of every upgrade slot in a highly specialized role. But lastly here, we are going to have another thematic build, but one that may actually become somewhat more relevant in the near future, and this will be the anti-armor support build. a Phase 1 squad that will make use of the RPS-6 rocket launcher, which will give you some extra dice along with Impact 2, which will ideally be used in fire support with another unit to create a very potent anti-armor attack that will likely stack 2 units impact keywords, and perhaps, I don't know, perhaps combine it with something that might give you Surge to Crit, i.e. the ISP, which could create a pretty awesome ball of energy that can really ding your opponent's armor. But since this unit is going to be camping within range 1 of a friendly vehicle it can fire support with, I did include the Clone Engineer as our personnel upgrade. Now, I did give a few other personnel options here, the first of which is the Clone Commander, and that Inspire 1 can be used to help boost other nearby Clone Trooper units, which may be incredibly useful if you are running something like a Rex Star, as Rex does only have Courage 2, and that Reliable is going to make you a little bit more durable against incoming fire. So if you are worried about the Clone Trooper squad dying rather than the ISP itself, this might be a good alternative to the Engineer, though honestly no personnel upgrades are necessary here, and to be quite blunt, you could run it with just the rocket launcher and your standard 4-man squad, as that will be enough dice in keywords when combined with fire support to get the job done. But lastly, I did include the Phase 1 Specialist here, and this is mainly for token generation to share with other clones. As keep in mind, when you are fire supporting, you're not allowed to spend the Phase 1's aim tokens as they are not technically shooting. But if you are in a gun line, I'm sure another friendly Clone Trooper squad nearby will happily take that token off you, but that is going to make the Specialist a little bit less desirable, as he won't be directly benefiting the gimmick that you are going for. And this will also be the case with our gear upgrade, being the targeting scopes, as the precise one that it does grant won't be usable in fire support. So if you do plan on running the squad in a situation where they will only be using fire support, say alongside an ISP or an ATRT, then you probably are better off dropping the targeting scopes and saving yourself 4 points, as again, it wouldn't be relevant in that scenario. But lastly here, we are going to be including a grenade option with impact grenades, and I think this actually is quite viable on this unit, as the RPS does have a minimum range of 2, and these impact grenades are going to give you some more anti-armor capabilities should an enemy vehicle close within range 1 of you, and stacking impact on those grenades all the way up to impact 5 can be quite vicious as mentioned earlier. Though at the end of the day, if you were strapped for 3 points, I wouldn't be too upset if you skipped it, as it is an upgrade that does rely on your enemy's vehicles getting ridiculously close to you, which is something that your rocket launcher ideally should have prevented. Now, I did also include the EMP droid popper grenades here that are going to give you Ion 1. However, make note that the way that this is worded means that it does not stack like impact grenades do. And honestly, if a vehicle has gotten within range 1 of your troopers, then it probably is a little too late for Ion to slow it down and prevent it from doing what it's there to do, i.e. deliver a squad of Wookiees. So I am definitely leaning more towards impact grenades, but fire supporting with an ISP to give it Ion would be pretty cool to see, so I figured it would be worth mentioning, though it is definitely a lower take by a wide margin. But much like our previous build, this fully kitted out unit, as shown, will come in at 98 points, but you could drop gear and grenades very easily and get it down to 91, and perhaps even drop that Clone Engineer to get it all the way down to just 73 points, to make it a much more budget fire support unit to aid your heavies. But that will wrap up our final build and move us along to the final portion of this video where I discuss my thoughts on the Phase 1 Clone Trooper and give them a ranking based on my personal opinion. And overall, I gotta say, Phase 1s are a very robust unit that have solid all-around baseline stats and a wide variety of upgrades they can take to tweak them to specialized battlefield roles. And really, the only main drawback I can say about them here, aside from their points cost, which is very relative to their efficiency, is the fact that they do only have a courage value of 1, which puts them on the same boat as shore troopers, who are a very pricey unit who loses their actions a bit too easily. And while that is somewhat remedied by the token sharing abilities, it definitely is a notable drawback when compared to their Phase 2 counterparts. Still, being a whole 10 points cheaper than the Phase 2 squad definitely gives Phase 1s a valuable spot in a Republic player's list building toolbox, especially if they are trying to lean in heavy on more specialized units like ARC Troopers or Heroes. And until we get a cheaper core unit, like perhaps Clone Cadets, they will hold value as the cheapest core unit in the Republic overall, which definitely holds value in a rather premium faction. That being said, at face value with no upgrades, Phase 1s are still one of the best core units in the game, and they can definitely hold their weight against other core units, and even some heroes. So all things considered, I am going to be giving the Phase 1 Clone Trooper a ranking of A, and while I am a Phase 2 fanboy myself, I do at times find myself building lists and then turn all my Phase 2 squads into Phase 1s to squeeze in some extra points. And that really is the dynamic that the Republic has going on with their core troopers. Do you want premium or extra premium? Personally, I like the extra premium with a side of Rex. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Are you all about the Phase 2s, or do you prefer the Phase 1s, be it due to their reduced cost or the options they get with that unit expansion upgrade? And if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications, as I will be rebooting more unit reviews in the near future. And until that day comes, as always, take care.